Energy Policy Study Group co-chairs for opening remarks and introduction.
Well, for those of you that joined us a few minutes late, we have probably one of the leading energy gurus in Alaska that's going to be speaking today. Meera Kohler, welcome. One of the things that I think is so interesting is that your program today is on power cost equalization. And we were just talking about the recently added Senate Bill 123 that was introduced today by the governor that is intended to create a sustainable energy development program under ADA. And power cost equalization and sustainable energy are definitely tied together in any policy discussions on a go-forward basis. I don't want to take any time away from your presentation, and I know that we will have many people with questions on the line. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Meera.
Thanks, Marianne. Always a pleasure to be here. Commonwealth North is one of my favorite institutions in the state, and with good reason. So Juanita invited me here today to talk a little bit about power cost equalization, and I framed it in the context of a look back at Alaska's past and where we were, how we got here, and hopefully we can talk about where we're going to go from here. So Juanita has been kind enough to allow me to share my screen, so I am going to try and do that. I actually have the PowerPoint up here. Let me see if I can run the slideshow. That's always nice when it happens. Are you able to see my screen?
Looks good, Meera.
Okay, so what we have here is, this is actually most of a presentation that I developed for the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. I gave them a presentation last December, and I've since made a similar presentation in a couple of places, notably to the Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation. But it is updated to 2021 data that is available because the AEA recently published their PCE report for FY 2020. So I've tried to incorporate some of that in here. So we talk about energy beyond the rail belt. Obviously the rail belt is Marianne's domain. Beyond the rail belt is something that I've been dabbling in for these going on 40 years now. So it is what I feel comfortable with. So with that, let's talk about where Alaska was back in the early days. So Alaska, of course, was a very remote, very rural state going back into the 1800s. And the first electrification that we know of really emerged in the late 1800s and kind of went along with the industrial development that the state saw. So Sitka was obviously the capital of Alaska for many years until statehood. And Sitka, Juneau are in Southeast Alaska. They had access to hydropower. And so you had quite a bit of gold mining activity that instigated the development of hydro there. And so they had sophisticated electrical systems going back 120, 130 years. In fact, Alaska Electric Light and Power, which is the utility that serves Juneau today, has actually been in existence since before the year 1900. So I think they're our longest running, longest standing utility in the state of Alaska, and they do a terrific job down there in Juneau. So other parts of Alaska got electrification tied into essentially mineral developments. And Nome, of course, had the gold rush. So Nome had power back in 1890, 1892, thereabouts. Cordova had the Kennecott mines, copper fields that were developed. So they've had power since the early 20th century. A lot of people don't realize that the first oil development in Alaska was in Katella, which is in Southeast Alaska, kind of between Cordova and Yakutat. And so there was power developed there. And in those contemporary times, Anchorage was a tent city. Its first power source was a 900 kilowatt coal-fired steam plant that was developed in 1916. A Kalutna hydro project was developed by a private power company in 1929 and eventually was sold to the the fledgling municipality of Anchorage in 1929, 1930, 1932, something like that, and has evolved from that point. So of course, all the rest of Alaska was pretty much powerless, so to speak, until the Rural Electrification Administration was established by President Roosevelt in 1935. And about that time was when the federal government was trying to populate Alaska, and it subsidized and sent pioneers to Alaska to start the farming industry here, which is what happened in Palmer, essentially. So MEA led the way. They were the very first electric cooperative that was formed, and that was in 1940. So pretty remarkable, considering it was only a few years after the Rural Electrification Act was actually established. MEA actually has been a powerhouse for the state and fostered a lot of development across the state. So a lot of the co-ops that were formed subsequent to MEA were helped along and fostered in a large way by MEA. So kudos to them. Never forget that. So following what happened in the Matanuska Valley, Kodiak Electric, surprisingly, was the next one to be formed, and that occurred in 1942, followed by Golden Valley and Fairbanks, which started to serve the outskirts of Fairbanks, with the inner city being served by Fairbanks Municipal Utility System. Kind of similar to Anchorage, of course, where you had the municipality of Anchorage that served the core of downtown Anchorage, and then Chugach Electric essentially was established in order to serve all the rest of Franklin. I mean, Spenard was another state, or another city, as it were. So, so you first start to see rural hubs become electrified in the early 60s, and Naknek was one of the first of those in 1960. And then you had Kotzebue and Dillingham and places like Bethel. Bethel, I think, was slightly earlier than that. Those were all energized in the 60s, essentially. However, rural Alaska, village Alaska, was bereft of any form of electricity. And that was because villages were so small, they were so scattered, they were hard to get to. In a few of the villages, you did get seasonal power, where you had a school that was able to connect to some of the homes and small businesses around them. They provide power when the school was running. So I don't believe there were any instances of communities where they had 24/7 power 365 days a year. People wanted energy, and so really what you had was oil-fired energy of one kind or another. You know, lighting was with seal oil lamps. There were small wind turbines, wind generators. There were small diesel generators and batteries. So the most entrepreneurial of the individuals made themselves electricity, but the vast majority made do with little to no external energy sources. There was no Alaska Energy Authority. The Alaska Energy Authority was first established as the Alaska Power Authority, and I believe that was in the early 70s that occurred. The Regulatory Commission, which was its original form was the Alaska Public Utilities Commission, also didn't exist until the early 70s. And I like to think that they were formed because Chugach Electric and Municipal Light and Power were running electricity down both sides of the street, racing to get to that next big store down 6th Avenue, for example. And so the RCA stepped in to divide the territory. And then, you know, and from there, they became who they are today. So there was virtually no central station service in any villages before 1960, which, of course, begged the question, what are we going to do? We cannot leave them without electricity forever. Rural Alaska was clamoring for electricity. And so Governor Hickel, in his first iteration as governor, appointed a task force. And so these are all familiar names. These were movers and shakers in Native Alaska. They were all young and handsome at that time. I mean, Willie Hensley, I think, was 21 years old when he was appointed to this task force. So this task force of 5 individuals essentially met copiously. I mean, they were meeting for 2, 3, 4 days at a time, once a month or more, trying to figure out what the best approach was to electrify rural Alaska. And so they looked at all the models that were out there, and they finally homed in on the cooperative model as potentially the best fit. Alaska is unique in the 50 states in that it has more of its residents served by cooperatives than any other state per capita. I think about 70% or more of the electricity that's provided in Alaska is through cooperatives. So it is the model that we use, and it's a good model. So AVEC was incorporated in 1967, and the REA, which is now the RUS, the REA did not think that this was a model that was going to work, because we had the potential of hundreds of villages, none of which were connected to each other, so non-contiguous service areas. Clearly, you had to have a headquarters in a commercial and political hub, which Anchorage was picked, since that was the one with the best access to the rest of the state. In order for AVEC to deliver service to any of the communities, those communities had to establish themselves as municipalities and have a local government with whom AVEC could essentially contract to operate the local power plant and service over there. And how that works is that we have an operating agreement with most of the villages that we deal with, and we actually own the assets in those communities, and we provide the financial wherewithal to operate those, but we expect the municipalities to essentially hire the local individuals and to supervise them so that we have on-site supervision. And that actually has worked fairly well over the years, you know, with a few blips here and there, but it's a model that we continue to have today. In order for a village to be eligible to become an AVEC community, 80% or more of the local residents had to physically sign up for service, and they had to pay their $5 membership fee. So now, back in the late 60s, $5 was a fairly significant chunk of cash, and we had tremendous success with getting people to sign up for service, to agree to abide by the rules of the utility, and because they wanted electricity. Not immediately, but not long later, the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, actually contracted to sign up for steady supply of electricity for schools. They were the anchor tenants. You had to have an anchor tenant in a community in order to be able to pay for the cost of service. And that actually, to this day, schools represent 25 to 30% of the electric sales of AVEC. And were it not with the schools, the cost of electricity in those villages would be a lot higher than it is today. So then we're talking about what happened before or up to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. So before the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System was established and the state had a significant revenue source, there was almost no transmission in the state of Alaska. There was obviously a line that Chugach Electric had built in the late 60s to connect the Beluga River gas field to Anchorage, because that was where the primary power plant was. That's a whole nother story about the Beluga River gas field, and someday you'll have to have a seminar specifically on that. And so that natural gas, which was and is heavily subsidized, heated and lit South Central Alaska. Fairbanks at that time was on their own resources. They relied on heavy oil and coal for their electricity. The cost of electricity in Fairbanks was equivalent to what it was in many of the villages, because there was no other source of energy. And everywhere else, diesel fuel was the primary energy source. There was very little hydropower in the state. As you can see, there was maybe 120, 130 megawatts of hydropower serving Alaska, and with most of that being in Southeast Alaska, a little bit in South Central, because Cooper Lake is one of actually, folks don't know, Chugach developed that about 50 years ago and has been in service ever since then. And then of course you have the Eklutna project that was developed in the late 20s. So then came oil in 1977. And the state began to spend its newfound wealth. Kudos to the legislature and the governor at that time. They recognized that affordable and reliable energy was the most important underlying infrastructure need of any community or any state. And so it began to look for ways to develop that energy and to provide affordable energy across the state. A major transmission line to Fairbanks was started. By that line, essentially Fairbanks was able to then buy surplus energy from South Central Alaska, primarily from municipal light and power. And their cost of power literally plummeted. I think it went down by almost 2/3 when they were able to start getting gas-fired generation from Anchorage. The Susitna Mega Project was again started. It actually had been looked at originally in the 50s, was shelved at the time, no money, honey, and was dredged up again. And at the time that it came up again in the mid-70s, we were looking at something akin to about a $1.5 billion project at that time. And it was very much considered to be the harbinger of the future. And I think that had that project continued at that time and been developed, we would have been looking back and going, oh, thank God we did that when we did. But we didn't. This is Alaska. The Bradley Lake project was started. The Four Dam Pool projects were developed. They call the Four Dam Pool because it's 4 hydro projects, each about 20, 25 megawatts in size. So they serve Valdez, Kodiak, Ketchikan, and Wrangell and Petersburg share a project. That was about a $350, $400 million project back in the early 80s. And a major study was commissioned to identify long-term projects across the state that could reduce the cost of electricity, and particularly rural Alaska. The intent was to reduce the cost of power in rural Alaska by any practical means. However, that did not materialize because it simply wasn't a practical way to go. And in 1980, shortly after the oil prices skyrocketed because of the oil embargo of the late 70s, the first power production cost assistance program was established. It was a modest program. It was a 1-year program, and it was aimed directly only at the cost of fuel to generate electricity. The following year, the precursor to the PCE program was established, and that was the Power Cost Assistance Program. And it was designed to self-extinguish in 5 years. So every year, the floor went up and the ceiling came down, and it was intended to provide short-term assistance. It was a fairly modest cost program. And then in 1984, in October of 1984, the Power Cost Equalization Program began. So it was enacted during the 1983 legislature, the FY84 legislature. And it was designed so that any utility that had used diesel power for more than 75% of their power generation in the prior year, which was 1983, was eligible to participate. And the program states its intent to reduce the cost of power to the average of the cost of residential power in Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau. At that time, it was 8.5 cents a kilowatt hour. The program essentially disappeared if a utility incurred costs above 52.5 cents. At that time, back in 1984, I think there was only 1 or maybe 2 locations where the cost of producing power was more than 52.5 cents. One standout, of course, is Lime Village. It's one that we always take a look at to see what's happening there. And I think the cost of power in Lime Village today is still close to $2 a kilowatt hour. So any cost above 52.5 cents was not covered. All users were eligible for the first 750 kilowatt hours that they used. And community facilities, which essentially are things like City Hall, street lighting, Boys and Girls Club, water and sewer facilities, they were eligible to get power cost equalization on all the kilowatt hours that they used. And there's a formula that's used to calculate that, but I don't think we want to get into that much detail right this minute. So let's just talk about AVEC. AVEC today, it was started off with the vision that it could potentially provide power to most, if not all, villages in rural Alaska. but it was a pretty euphemistic goal because the thought was that it was only going to cost about $100,000 at most, $50,000 to $100,000 to build generation and distribution facilities in a village. That was not realistic then, it's not realistic now. I can tell you that at this point in time, if you build a village from scratch, say a village of 500 people, you're building a generation system, you're building a tank farm to hold the diesel fuel, and you're building a distribution system, you're looking at something close to $5+ million for that one location. Nonetheless, our first 3 villages were actually electrified a year after we were incorporated, so 1968. And I look back and I think, wow, I mean, those guys did it right. That was amazing that they achieved that. And these were all from scratch, as it were. They did not have any distribution or any generation assets when AVEC stepped in. So today, AVEC is serving 58 villages. Actually, right now, it's 59, right, Bill? Because we just started serving Twin Hills via a tie line, and we are in the process of bringing them on as a 59th village. Of those 58 villages, 20 of them are receiving power from renewables. So that's a pretty remarkable statistic. And I can tell you that we have, most recently, one of our locations, 49% of the electricity that was provided came from wind. And that's a remarkable achievement. Kind of a one-off situation, but nonetheless something to be very proud of. So AVEC operates 49 power plants, serves 32,000 people, which is about 38% of the entire PCE population that's served. We represent 41% of the total PCE dispersed. We serve villages as small as 77. Shagluck is the smallest. I haven't looked at what the latest statistics are, but we have at least 4 or 5 villages that are below 100 in population. Bethel is the largest community at over 6,000. And by comparison, as you know very well, Anchorage is almost 300,000 in population. So we have a lot of power plants to serve a population that's a fraction the size of Anchorage. So you have to take that into context as to why it is so expensive out in rural Alaska. So the question that arises is, why do we subsidize rural Alaska? Why don't they stand on their own 2 feet? And the answer to that is that was the deal that was reached in 1984 when it was recognized that there is no other silver bullet, there is no answer to that overwhelming question of why can't we bring the cost of power down in those communities? In 1985, the first full year of PCE, the PCE utilities paid $1.17 a gallon for diesel. That was 25 times what the cost of railbed gas was at that time, which was 35 cents a 1,000 cubic feet. You know, a very remarkable spread. And that $1.17 today, in the latest PCE report, I think it's $3.07 a gallon. So, you know, that's not bad when you consider that the cost of railbed gas now is about $6.50 per MCF. So they've gone up 20 times. We've only gone up less than 3 times. So I guess you can be proud of that. Another reason was that billions of dollars were spent or committed to reduce the cost of power for urban Alaska and for communities that are fortunate enough to have hydropower. And railbelt communities have continued to benefit from heavily subsidized natural gas since the 1960s. Taxes on natural gas are still capped at 17.7 cents per 1,000 cubic feet. And if you take that, and what is that equivalent? 1,000 cubic feet is 1 million BTUs. You divide that by the BTU value of a gallon of fuel. So you've got about 7.5 gallons of diesel fuel. So that's 2.5 cents per gallon of diesel fuel in the way of taxes. Just look at the regime on the North Slope now. We're even looking at raising taxes on diesel right now as well to substantially more than 10 times that amount. So it's a moving target, but it must be recognized that the subsidy for rural Alaska is a fraction of the subsidy for all the rest of the state. So the Endowment Fund came to be when it was established in FY 2000, and this was because PCE was chronically underfunded. It was an annual legislative battle to fund PCEs, the urban legislators versus the rural legislators, and you fight for the scraps on the table. And as a result, PCE always got underfunded. In fact, 15 years between FY92 and FY07, it was underfunded at less than 100% of what the cost should have been. Sometimes as much as 40% below what should have been appropriated for PCE. So the Endowment Fund was established with an intention to fully fund it so that the earnings of the Endowment Fund would pay for PCE and you would not have to go back to the general fund year after year for funding. So the first funding came through a $100 million deposit from the CBR, the Constitutional Budget Reserve. And the state also decided to sell the Fort Ampoule hydro projects, and the proceeds from that sale went into the Endowment Fund. So that was another $84 million. And then the governor added, the legislature added $182.7 million in FY07 and another $400 million in FY12. Every one of those deposits was as a result of a rural-urban compromise to offset what was planned for urban Alaska. So the value of the Endowment Fund as of the end of March of this year, and it's already posted on the Department of Revenue, is $1.13 billion. And that has gone up steadily over the years. And most recently, as you know, this last year, we had some pretty good response to the market, and that allowed the fund to increase nicely. The latest withdrawal during this current year is about $54.5 million, which has gone to pay for PCE and municipal assistance. So the way that the program reads, after PCE is funded from the earnings, if there are excess earnings above that level needed for PCE, 70% of those excess earnings are available to fund other things. And those other things are named up to $30 million for municipal assistance, formerly known as revenue sharing. Then after that is funded and there's still funds available, up to $25 million can be appropriated for renewable energy grants and for RPSU, which stands for Rural Power System Upgrades. BFU is bulk fuel utility upgrade projects. So there are funds available. And I think 2 years ago, the total that was available for PCE, municipal assistance, and the Renewable Energy Fund was about $85 million. So the fund is spinning off money that's going to a lot of good purposes, but we fiercely protect the Endowment Fund from being tapped for other things because it needs to be kept intact in order to fund the purposes for which it was established. So how is PCE funded, or how is it, how is it funded? So the governor's budget for the Alaska Energy Authority includes funding for PCE. The governor has included full funding for PCE for several years now, and it typically comes out of the Endowment Fund. It's identified by the governor. Until the Endowment Fund was fully funded and was spinning off enough money over a 3-year period, it was largely general funds or entirely general funds. Since 2014, PCE funding has come entirely out of the Endowment Fund. The legislature decides on the final amount and the source of that funding. And if it appropriates less than is needed, the PCE rates are prorated. And that proration is done by the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, who is the one that issues the PCE rates and then any prorations that are necessary. So let's see, there have been no draws in the general fund since 2014. PCE has cost $395 million since FY08. This does not include FY21. I didn't change these numbers. I thought about that last night and went, too late. And off that 395 million, 320 million has come from the Endowment Fund. So you can just add $29 million to both those numbers, and that brings you up to today. So what are the mechanics of PCE? As I said earlier, in order to be eligible to receive PCE, the utility had to have generated 3/4 of its power in 1983 from diesel fuel. The utility submits its operational cost data to the Regulatory Commission, and the Regulatory Commission determines the eligible costs and then computes the PCE rate for that community. The utility bills the customers according to their regular tariff. The utility applies the PCE credits to the customer's bill, and the customer is required to pay their bill after that PCE credit. The utility then bills the state, Alaska Energy Authority, for all the PCE that's been credited and submits detailed billing records. Jeff will testify as to our billing records. I think he gets a headache every time it comes in the door. We do have to file an annual report with the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, which is thoroughly reviewed by them. They update the fuel cost as our costs change, and they will review non-fuel costs every 3 to 5 years or upon request. So if we have a dramatic change in our non-fuel costs, we will submit earlier for a review of those costs, because we want to make sure that our PCE is appropriately covering what those costs are. Of course, we're more anxious when our costs go up than when our costs go down, but nonetheless, we try and stay current on those. So let's take a snapshot of where we are looking at between 1985 and 2020. 1985, as I said earlier, is the first full year of PCE. At that time, the floor has gone up from that time from 8.5 cents to 20.63 cents. So that's 143% increase. The ceiling has been raised from 52.5 cents to $1. That happened in 2008 at the time that we had the skyrocketing oil prices, and as a result, costs for the utilities dramatically went up. I mean, I remember that our fuel cost per kilowatt hour went up to as high as 45 cents a kilowatt hour when the cost of fuel was at that level. The amount of electricity that's eligible for PCE has dramatically gone down. It's been reduced by 1/3 from 750 kilowatt hours to 500 kilowatt hours. All the commercial customers were taken off PCE, so that's 6,000 plus commercial customers that do not get PCE. A point of pride I would point out to you is that fuel cost is up 127%, but efficiency is also up very significantly. So the fuel cost per kilowatt hour went from 10.3 cents to 19 cents in that 35-year period. That's pretty remarkable. Non-fuel costs per kilowatt hour are up 37%. That's less than 1% per annum compounded growth. It was a little over 14 cents a kilowatt hour in 85, and it's 19.3 cents in 2020. And look at the total cost of PCE. In 86, it was $17.8 million. And in FY20, it was $29 million. So we have stayed remarkably contained over the last 35 years, I think. And a snapshot of the program changes. I take your eyes down to the bottom of the page. In FY86, PCE accounted for 32.4% of total costs. And in FY20, that number was 16.6%. So 83.4% of the total cost of production of electricity in rural Alaska is borne by the local residents, not by PCE. So with that, my last slide here is the answer to the question, does most of PCE go to overheads? I mean, there is this conception that PCE is paying for all these overheads. It's being abused in some fashion. Here's the reality. The fuel costs in FY20, as you can see, were almost $87 million. The non-fuel costs, just about the same, for a total cost of $174 million. And you see that PCE was $29 million, which is basically 33.5% of fuel costs alone, nothing towards non-fuel costs, or 16.6% of total costs. So PCE has never been abused. There are perceptions that somehow it's being abused. I can tell you that is not the case. I would pose it to you that PCE has, to the extent that's practical, done its job. but there's a lot more to do. We are only dealing with a fraction of the energy that's being used in rural Alaska, and it is a very, very difficult burden to bear. So with that, I am done with my slideshow, and I turn it over to Lynetta. I'm sure she's flooded with questions.
All right, thank you so much, Meera. Let's see, there we go. All right, well, I don't have any questions in the chat just yet, but I wanted to start off with a question for you, Meera. You know, it seems to me, as I listened to your presentation, having been through much of that history myself, it seems like there's always some challenge, political challenge to the PCE. And I'm wondering if you see a potential to fix that in some way. Is there some structural change or something? I see PCE as essentially a social contract between Alaskans. And so when we have these political challenges, I think our memory's so short, or have the politics changed? What can we do to honor the commitments that we've made through maybe some sort of structural change to the program?
Well, you know, there's two aspects to that. And I think the more important one of those is the Endowment Fund issue. It has been seen as an attractive pot of gold under a rock. And I know that there have been many, you know, minor and less minor efforts to tap that fund. You know, most recently, just this year, a modest attempt to redirect about $10 million from the Endowment Fund to pay for rural power systems upgrades. While I don't have any significant issue with using it for that purpose, there is already a pathway established to achieve that through earnings on the Endowment Fund. And so we should stick with that. My big concern is that if we allow one modest infiltration into the fund, no matter how fitting the purpose may be and how suitable it may be for our ends, it opens the door for a flood. I'm reminded of the Rail Belt Energy Fund. So back in 1986, when the bottom fell out of the oil market and the $500 million appropriation for Susitna was set aside, $144 million had already been spent from that. And the other $356 million was placed in the Rail Belt Energy Fund. And the intent was to use that for Rail Belt energy projects. And I can assure you, that's not where it went. I mean, a portion of it did, but I'd say it was about a third of that fund was actually used for Rail Belt energy projects. I'm so sorry, my cat wants to take over this conversation, but I'm trying very hard to keep her down.
That's perfectly okay.
You know, so that is sort of an example of what it would be with us as well. We cannot afford to let that happen to rural Alaska, because then we're back in the annual debate about whether or not to fund PCE. And that is not a fair debate, because one thing I will tell you, as you can see from those numbers, PCE only impacts electricity, and it only impacts 30% of the electricity that's sold in rural Alaska. What about the other 70%? And what about the heat? I mean, I have a heavily subsidized heat bill here in Anchorage. I kind of like it, but I sure would like to be able to share that with the rest of the state.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you. We have a question in chat from David Lockhart. Can you talk a little bit about some of AVEC's success stories with training and hiring village residents for electrical utility jobs?
I love that. You know, I will tell you that we have had a partnership with the AEA and the Denali Commission and AvTech. And we have helped develop the AvTech training programs, and we send a lot of our rural power plant operators there. It's difficult because it is a long period of time away from home, which is very hard for a villager. They are so tied into their family and their community that to have to leave for several weeks is very difficult. And we've developed a very robust in-house training program where we go to the village and we have dedicated trainers. That's all they do, and they train on that equipment there itself. We have also been able to advance a number of our rural power plant operators. So basically, they grow up, they get really good, they decide to retire. We go, no, 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 you can't retire. Why don't you come work for us full time? And so a lot of them do. They're based in their home community and they become traveling technicians for us. And they become part of our training program and our operations program. And that has really, it's been fabulous. We even have a lineman who has come out of rural Alaska, and we have wind technicians that have come out of rural Alaska. So there is a lot of potential out there. When we're doing Denali Commission funded, primarily Denali Commission funded projects, which of course are very few now because they've been dramatically reduced in their funding, we were one of their two major energy partners and still are, us and the Alaska Energy Authority. And so whenever we build a project in rural Alaska, we actually take skilled training out to those communities, and we train them to be contractors, welders, pipe builders, carpenters, you know, all the skill sets that will stand them in good stead into the future. So we have been part of that. We also do HAZWOPER training in our communities. So all of our communities, all our power plant operators are HAZWOPER trained, our technicians are HAZWOPER trained, and we keep up that training by doing annual certification. So there again, that is actually a contractual relationship with Rural Alaska Fuel Services, which we started 15 years ago, and with technicians that we bring to train our own people during an intensive 2-week training period here in Anchorage every year. So, you know, we recognize that the wealth of AVEC is not in its $250 million worth of assets out there in the field, it's our people. And so we believe in investing in our people, and I think we do that pretty well.
Great. Wonderful to hear all
Thanks
that.
for the question, David.
Mary Ann has a question for you. Mary Ann?
Yeah, Meera, of course, incredible presentation. Thank you so much for all your expertise and sharing that oversight with us. One of the game changers for the villages that are under AVEC was when you did the Barge fuel distribution system. Can you tell us what some of those other, you know, opportunities that you see out there I'm not saying replace PCE, but make PCE more sustainable? What would they be if you had that magic wand, please?
Oh, you're opening the floodgates here, Marianne. Just to tell folks a little bit about the tugs and barges, though, since I didn't mention that at all in the presentation. I don't know how many of you remember that back in the early 2004, Crowley and Yukon Fuel were the two major fuel distributors in Western Alaska, and Crowley decided to buy out Yukon Fuel. Much to our dismay, we were horror-struck when that happened, because we were going to be reduced from a duopoly, but a very competitive duopoly, to a monopoly. And so we actually filed suit with the state and on the federal level as well, you know, citing monopolistic violations, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, that lawsuit was settled with a consent decree from the state of Alaska that required Crowley to spin off a portion of the assets being acquired to create another competitor. And so that went off to fund Delta Western, and you know, they acquired some more vessels from Crowley and otherwise, but they never did become a very robust competitor. And so what essentially happened was that the board, the AVEC board, sat down with me and a couple of other players, and we cooked up a way to inject competition into that market. And to do so, we had to create another entity that would provide robust competition in rural Alaska. And so we actually funded and paid for the construction of 2 tug and barge sets, which even today are the most efficient tug and barge sets in Western Alaska. They are the interlocking tug and barge sets rather than the towed pushed tug and barge sets. And those 2 have now been on the water since 2011. And they provide about 80% of the fuel that is used in Western Alaska, rural Alaska by AVAC. We still have a contract with Crowley to provide our fuel in Bethel, and we were able to negotiate what I felt was a very fair contract, and we continue to operate under that contract. And the cost of fuel for our utility in Bethel literally went down by 50% when we were able to execute that contract. And so they provide fuel, these tug and barge sets. They're owned by AVAC. They're operated by Vitus Marine or Vitus Energy. A scrappy little can-do, will-do company. They have really, really done a fabulous job. We were figuring that we would see a benefit back to our villages just through our fuel costs of about $500,000 a year, and I think we achieve about double that through all of the affected projects through them. Our hauling of we get a kickback for certain things like lighterage and tank, the tankers that we bring in to refill the barges. It's just there's a lot of little things there, and it all goes directly back to the electric bill to lower that. So it's been a terrific relationship. What other things are there out there? Honestly, because you have so many communities that are so distant and such small utilities there and such modest kilowatt hour sales, until we connect those villages to each other and create a grid, whether it's an interregional or a regional or statewide grid, we're not going to be able to do very much about the basic cost of power. So this brings us to my pet project, which is the All Alaska project, which is a large-scale generation, natural gas-fired generation system, North Slope, and then across the state, wherever there already are large-scale gas generation, they all feed into a common grid. Because you have a large common grid that's serving the whole state, you're able to harness large quantities of renewables, large quantities of wind, and it's across the state, so you wind up with a much more ubiquitous distribution of renewables. That is a project the state needs to put its arms around and take a hard look at it and see, how can we make it happen? Don't tell me the reasons why it won't work. It's a classic chicken and the egg thing. I've been told, but where are the loads? The loads aren't there because you're not feeding them. If you had the ability to feed them affordable energy, those loads would materialize. The world is hungry for low cost energy, and we have the capability here. So let's just do it. Sorry, my pet horse.
I was waiting for, love it.
And applause coming from the crowd. Bernie, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
No, not right now.
Okay. All right.
Being there. Thank you.
We've got a couple of, leveraging off what you just said, Bob Cox is recalling your passion for a direct current network to connect Western Alaska communities. Could PCE funds be used to seed a project like that?
Well, I think that if there was something judiciously put together, let's talk about PCE funds. As I pointed out, in FY20, the total PCE funds that were utilized, that was sent, were $29 million. Okay, we have long heard, well, use that $30 million to build renewables. All right, well, $29 million would build maybe 5 or 6 renewable projects. So the other 100 and some communities that are receiving PCE now would have no PCE and would have full cost power. So I think that what the governor has just proposed with SB 123 has got the potential to be part of that seeding process. Now, can PCE Endowment Fund earnings be spun off into that to help to build that? Absolutely, because it meshes with the purpose of the Endowment Fund. And there's no reason why that couldn't be. But in the meantime, you got to keep funding PCE. You got to keep funding municipal assistance. If we take that $30 million out of the pockets of these communities, they will shut the doors. They have no other resources to pay for the basic costs of running a municipality. So we have to look at the whole picture of how we can sustain these communities with the modest spinoff from the endowment fund. If we take the entire endowment fund and say, okay, here's $1 billion, add $5 billion to it, and we'll build the All Alaska Grid. Well, we need a ramp to get to that point. So let's take off the 10 years worth of PCE that's necessary to fund those communities until that project becomes a reality, and take the rest of it, but give me a promise that this is what it's going to be used for. And this is what the end result is going to be. I think we can get there.
Yeah, along those lines, Jim Strandberg is asking, you know, what are the things that organizations like Commonwealth North and you know, members of the community can do to help protect the PCE endowment fund?
Well, there are, you know, legislators are working on those solutions. I know that HB 57 seeks to identify funds or to protect funds that are not sweepable. You know, we ran into this buzzsaw 3 years ago when all of a sudden the administration decided that the PCE fund was sweepable, and overnight we went from fully funded to no funding. I mean, to the point where the Regulatory Commission issued a memo saying that we have no funds. There are no funds for PCE. The PCE rate will be set to 0 unless funds are appropriated to pay for it. So we can't have that happen. That has simply got to change. So we have to protect the fund from being swept. And I would like to see it being identified as a resource that cannot be tapped into willy-nilly for other purposes besides what it's statutorily intended to be. And, you know, greater minds than mine are working on that.
Okay. All right. Well, Meera, thank you so much. I don't have any other questions for you in the chat. I'll just turn back to one last call to Marianne and Bernie. Any other questions?
No, that's wonderful. And Meera, thank you so much. You know, the term statesman comes to mind. And when you look at the people that have been truly leaders in our state and have given public policy discussions new meaning, you're at the forefront. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you, Marianne. That is so sweet. As you can see, I have a hard time tearing myself away.
And I hope you never do. Thank you.
I'll try not to.
We've got applause coming in, a roar from the crowd. So thank you so much, Meera.
My pleasure. Anytime.
All right. And I think with that, we're adjourned.
Well, and I must make a plea for anybody that's watching that isn't a member of Commonwealth North. The very first thing I did when I retired was I became a standalone member of Commonwealth North. So you can do it too.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, we'll invite you back again, Meera. Thanks so much. Take good care, everybody. Happy weekend. Stay warm.
Bye all.